You would hurt someone if a man in a lab coat told you to. You'd betray your own judgment. You'd ignore the screams. And the most terrifying part is you don't believe me. It's 1961. A man walks into a Yale laboratory believing he's participating in a memory study. He's told he'll be the teacher. Another volunteer, the learner, sits in an adjacent room strapped to a chair with electrodes attached to his wrists. The teacher's job is simple. Read word pairs. When a learner makes a mistake, deliver an electric shock. Each error increases the voltage. 15 volts, 30, 60. The switches on the panel climb all the way to 450 volts, labeled simply XXX. At 150 volts, the learner begins to complain. At 300, he screams that his heart is bothering him and demands to be released. At 330, there is only silence. And here is what freezes the blood. 65% of ordinary people, people like you, people like me, pulled the lever all the way to the end. Not because they were sadists, not because they enjoyed it, but because a man in a gray lab coat standing nearby said 4 words, "Please continue. The experiment requires it." Stanley Milgram never set out to prove that humans are monsters. He wanted to understand something far more disturbing. He wanted to know why ordinary people abandon their conscience when someone in authority gives an order. The Holocaust had ended only 16 years earlier, and the world was still asking how. How did factory workers operate death camps? How did neighbors turn in neighbors? How did educated professionals participate in systematic murder? The common answer was that Germans were different, that something in their culture made them uniquely susceptible to evil. Milgram suspected otherwise. He suspected the truth was worse, that the capacity to obey destructive orders wasn't German. It was human. The results shattered every prediction. Psychiatrists at Yale had estimated that perhaps 1 or 2% of subjects would go all the way to 450 volts, and those would be psychopaths. They were wrong by a factor of 30. The teachers who administered the shocks were not cruel. Many of them protested. They sweated. Their hands trembled. Some laughed nervously. A stress response so pronounced that observers found it disturbing to watch. But when the experimenter said the study must continue, they continued. When the learner, who was actually an actor and received no real shocks, begged to be released, they looked to the man in the lab coat for guidance. And he gave none, just calm insistence. The responsibility, he assured them, was his. That last detail is crucial. The diffusion of responsibility. When authority assumes accountability, the human mind performs a kind of moral magic trick. The action is still yours. Your hand pulls the lever. Your decision continues the experiment. But psychologically, you've transferred the weight of that choice upward. You're no longer an autonomous moral agent making a decision. You're an instrument, a tool, and tools don't carry guilt. This mechanism is woven into us at a depth most people never examine. From infancy, survival depends on obedience to authority. The parent knows what's safe. The teacher knows what's correct. The police officer knows what's lawful. These hierarchies kept early human society functional. Societies functional. Rebellion against the chief or the elder could mean exile. And exile meant death. Natural selection didn't favor the questioners. It favored those who could suppress their own judgment and defer to the group's established power structure. We inherited those brains. We carry that wiring into boardrooms and courtrooms and military barracks. And it activates automatically when the situation presents the right cues. A uniform is one such cue. In 1974, social psychologist Leonard Bickman conducted an experiment so simple it seems almost absurd. He had researchers approach pedestrians in New York City and give them commands. Pick up that paper bag. Stunt. On the other side of this sign, give that man a dime for the parking meter. Sometimes the researcher wore street clothes, sometimes a milkman's uniform, sometimes a security guard's uniform. When the person giving the order wore a guard uniform, compliance jumped to over 80%. People obeyed a complete stranger telling them to give away their money, simply because that stranger wore a costume that signaled authority. They didn't ask why. They didn't question the absurdity of a guard caring about parking meters. The uniform bypasses rational thought entirely, but the fear of authority runs deeper than costumes and symbols. The amygdala, our ancient threat detection system, doesn't distinguish well between physical danger and social danger. To our evolutionary ancestors, being cast out from the tribe was as deadly as facing a predator. Perhaps more so, and authority figures hold that power. They can exclude, they can punish, they can mark you as deviant, and once you're marked, the group may turn on you. This isn't paranoia. This is pattern recognition written into our neurology over hundreds of thousands of years. Consider what happens in your body when a police officer's lights flash in your rearview mirror. Even if you've done nothing wrong, your heart rate increases. Your palms sweat. Stress hormones flood your system. You're not responding to an immediate physical threat. You're responding to the presence of someone who has the power to disrupt your life, to impose consequences, to exercise authority over you. And here's what makes it interesting. That response occurs even when you consciously know you're innocent. Even when you rationally understand the officer will likely just wave you past. The fear isn't rational. It's automatic. The Stanford Prison Experiment of 1971, despite its serious methodological flaws and ethical violations, revealed something genuine about how quickly authority corrupts and how readily people submit to it. Philip Zimbardo assigned college students to play prisoners and guards in a mock prison. Within days, the guards, ordinary young men with no history of violence, were psychologically tormenting the prisoners. They didn't do this because Zimbardo told them to abuse anyone. They did it because they'd been given authority, and authority creates a role, and roles have scripts. The script for guard includes dominance. The script for prisoner includes submission. Both groups performed their parts with disturbing enthusiasm until the experiment was shut down early. What Zimbardo understood, and what Milgram understood, is that situations create behavior more powerfully than personality does. We like to believe that character is stable, that good people do good things and bad people do bad things. But the research suggests otherwise. It suggests that most people will do terrible things if the situation is structured correctly, if authority is present, if responsibility is diffused, if the victim is distant or dehumanized, if the action can be framed as necessary or legitimate. These aren't conditions that excuse cruelty. They're conditions that produce it reliably, predictably, across cultures and contexts. The corporate world discovered this decades ago. Organizational psychologists study what they call destructive obedience, the phenomenon of employees carrying out unethical orders because a superior demands it. Accounting fraud, environmental violations, suppression of safety data. These aren't typically the work of evil masterminds. They're the work of ordinary people who faced a choice between their conscience and their career, and authority made the choice feel inevitable. The boss says it has to be done this way. The company's survival depends on it. Everyone else is going along. What difference would your refusal make? The same mental machinery that made Milgram subjects pull the lever makes mid-level managers falsify reports. But there's another dimension to the fear of authority that's less discussed and more insidious. It's not just that we fear punishment from authority. It's that we fear the absence of authority. Umanskraba hierarchy. We're uncomfortable in situations where power is ambiguous or where we're forced to make decisions without guidance from above. This is why leaderless groups often fracture, or why organizations in crisis immediately seek someone to take charge. The vacuum of authority creates anxiety because it returns responsibility to us, and responsibility is heavy. Eric Fromm wrote about this in Escape from Freedom, published in 1941 as Fascism Consumed Europe. He argued that modern freedom terrifies people because it comes with the burden of choice, the weight of self-determination. When you're free, your failures are yours. Your mistakes can't be blamed on the king or the priest or the system. And so people flee from freedom into authoritarianism, into systems where someone else makes the decisions and absorbs the blame. It's not that they love the dictator. It's that they fear the responsibility of living without one. This need for authority extends into how we process information. The appeal to authority fallacy is considered a logical error, but psychologically, it's almost irresistible. When an expert speaks, when a doctor or a lawyer or a professor makes a claim, we tend to accept it without deep scrutiny. Not because we're stupid, but because cognitive resources are limited. We can't personally verify every piece of information we encounter. We must rely on credentialed authorities, but this creates vulnerability. It means that someone with the right credentials, the right position, the right symbols of expertise can lead us almost anywhere. And we'll follow because the alternative is to doubt everything, to verify everything, to live in a state of exhausting skepticism. Stanley Milgram conducted variations of his original experiment to test what factors increased or decreased obedience. When the experimenter left the room and gave orders by telephone, obedience dropped. Physical proximity to authority matters. When the learner was in the same room as the teacher, obedience decreased but still remained shockingly high. When the teacher had to physically press the learner's hand onto a shock plate, obedience dropped to 30%. But 30%, nearly 1 in 3 people would still force another human being's hand onto a metal plate to electrocute them because someone in a lab coat said it was necessary. When 2 experimenters gave contradictory orders, obedience collapsed almost entirely. Authority requires consensus. When it fractures, so does compliance. These findings map onto historical atrocities with the Nazis didn't invent obedience to authority. They exploited a universal human tendency and industrialized it. The bureaucrats the trains to Auschwitz weren't all fanatics. Many were clerks, following orders, solving logistical problems, doing their jobs. Hannah Arendt called this the banality of evil, and what she meant was that great evil doesn't require great malice. It requires ordinary people doing what they're told in a system that makes horror routine. This is why whistleblowers are so rare and so psychologically tormented. 2. Blow the whistle is to defy authority, to claim that your judgment is superior to that of your superiors, to risk not just your job, but your identity as a loyal member of the organization. The social cost is enormous. Whistleblowers are often ostracized, not because their colleagues disagree with them, but because they violated an unspoken rule. You don't break ranks. You don't challenge the hierarchy publicly, even when the hierarchy is wrong, even when it's criminal. The fear of exile, the fear of being marked as a traitor, is often stronger than the moral imperative to speak. And yet authority's power is not absolute. It has boundaries, and understanding those boundaries is essential. Milgram's experiment showed that obedience decreases when authority loses legitimacy, when its commands become too obviously wrong, or when the subject has social support to resist. In one variation, when 2 other teachers, actually actors, refused to continue, 90% of real subjects also refused. Resistance is contagious. The presence of even one Other person willing to say no breaks the spell of authority. This is why authoritarian regimes are so obsessed with eliminating dissent. Not because one voice changes policy, but because one voice gives others permission to speak. The fear of authority also weakens when people are reminded of their individual moral responsibility. In follow-up studies, when subjects were told explicitly that they, not the experimenter, would be held responsible for any harm, obedience rates fell dramatically. The diffusion of responsibility only works when authority genuinely assumes accountability. When that shield is removed, conscience reasserts itself. This has implications for everything from military training to corporate ethics. Structures that force individuals to personally own their decisions make destructive obedience harder. Yet we must be careful not to romanticize rebellion. Not all authority is illegitimate. Societies require coordination, and coordination requires some form of hierarchy. The surgeon's authority in the operating room saves lives. The air traffic controller's authority prevents disasters. The problem isn't authority itself, but unchecked authority. Authority that demands obedience without accountability. Authority that punishes questions and rewards compliance regardless of outcome. The contemporary world has made the psychology of authority more complex, not less. We no longer have a single king or pope. We have diffuse networks of expertise, credentialing institutions, algorithmic systems, and bureaucratic structures. Authority is everywhere and nowhere. You can't rebel against the algorithm that denies your loan application. You can't question the corporate structure that outsourced your job to another country. The very diffuseness of modern authority makes resistance harder because there's no clear target, no single figure to confront. Social media has created a strange new form of authority, the authority of the crowd. Viral outrage can destroy a career faster than any boss. Online mobs enforce conformity more effectively than any government. We fear being on the wrong side of public opinion, being canceled, being excluded from the digital tribe. This is still the fear of authority. It's just that the authority is no longer a person in a uniform, but an emergent property of millions of people deciding collectively who deserves punishment. And the psychology is the same. The fear of exile, the need to conform, the willingness to participate in collective cruelty, as long as everyone else is doing it too. Milgram subjects often ask the experimenter if they should continue. They wanted permission to stop. They wanted authority to release them from the terrible choice. But the experimenter never did. He simply repeated that the experiment required them to go on. And they went on, not because they were forced. The door was unlocked. They could leave anytime. But leaving meant defying authority, and defying authority meant confronting the full weight of their own agency, their own capacity to choose. It's easier to be the lever than the person deciding whether to pull it. You are not immune. The same hands that would comfort a crying child, that would help a stranger with directions, that would donate to charity, those hands would pull the lever. They would follow the order. They would defer to the man in the lab coat, not because you're weak or cruel, but because you're human, and humans fear authority more than they fear their own capacity for harm. If this documentary made you uncomfortable, good. Discomfort is the first step toward awareness. Subscribe to see more explorations of the dark corners of human psychology. Share this with someone who thinks they'd never obey an unjust order. And the next time someone in authority tells you to do something that feels wrong, remember this. The responsibility is never theirs alone. It's always yours too.